The silver moonlight was just beginning to surrender to the pale, bruised violet of dawn when the world changed for Lady Elara Vance. The gardens of the Blackwood estate were cloaked in a heavy, humid mist, the kind that muffled footsteps and turned every shadow into a secret. Elara had escaped the stifling heat of the ballroom, her lungs aching for the crisp night air and her heart heavy with a future she hadn't chosen. In 3 days, her father would announce her engagement to Arthur Thorne, the Duke of Pembroke. Arthur was stable, kind, and utterly predictable, the perfect husband for a lady of her standing. But Arthur was not the man who had followed her into the labyrinth of hedges. It was his brother, Julian. Julian Thorne, the Earl of Vane, was everything his brother was not. He was the dark whisper in the corridors of London, the man whose reputation was built on broken hearts and defiant gazes. For years, Elara and Julian had existed in a state of polite, sharp-edged warfare. Every encounter was a duel of wits, every glance a challenge. He found her too rigid, she found him too reckless. And yet, there they were, standing where the jasmine grew thickest. "You should be inside, Elara," Julian's voice had drifted through the darkness, low and sandpaper rough. "My brother is likely looking for his prize." Elara had turned, her chin lifted in defiance, though her pulse was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I am no one's prize, Julian. Least of all yours to comment upon." He had stepped closer then, the scent of sandalwood and expensive brandy trailing him. "Is that what you tell yourself? That you're happy to be a duchess in a golden cage? You're a creature of fire, Elara. Arthur is a man of rain." The argument that followed was familiar, a fast-paced exchange of insults and truths that they had been hurling at each other since childhood. But the air between them had shifted. It was no longer just anger, it was a magnetic, suffocating pull. When he reached out to grab her arm to stop her from walking away, the contact felt like an electric shock. They both froze. The silence of the dawn was absolute, save for the frantic beating of two hearts. Julian's eyes, dark and unreadable, searched hers. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate hunger. Before she could breathe, before she could protest, he pulled her into the shadows of a stone archway. His mouth crashed against hers, not with the gentleness of a suitor, but with the bottled-up frustration of years of unspoken desire. It was a kiss that tasted of stolen moments and forbidden thoughts. It was a kiss that ruined everything. And then, as the first ray of sun broke over the horizon, he was gone, leaving Elara trembling in the cold light of day. Now, 12 hours later, Elara sat in the Thorne family's drawing room, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their shaking. Across from her sat Arthur, smiling with a warmth that made her stomach churn with guilt. And standing by the window, his back to the room, was Julian. The sunlight caught the dark waves of his hair, and Elara could still feel the phantom pressure of his lips against hers. "I've spoken to your father, Elara," Arthur said, his voice a balm she didn't want. "He is delighted. We shall make the announcement at the gala tomorrow night. I cannot tell you how honored I am that you've accepted my hand." Elara forced a smile, her throat tight. "You are very kind, Arthur. I look forward to our life together." At those words, Julian finally turned. His expression was a mask of cool indifference, but his eyes were burning coals. "Congratulations are in order, then," Julian said, his voice dripping with a sarcasm only Elara could detect. "A match made in heaven. Or at least, in a very well-negotiated contract." Arthur laughed, oblivious to the jagged tension in the room. "Don't mind my brother, Elara. He's always been cynical about the institution of marriage. Probably because he knows no woman would have him for more than a week. On the contrary, Arthur, Julian replied, walking toward them with the predatory grace of a wolf. He stopped just inches from Elara, leaning down to pick up a fallen glove from the floor. As he handed it back to her, his fingers lingered against her palm. I find I am suddenly very interested in the institution. It's the timing that's the tragedy. Elara felt the heat rise to her cheeks. The audacity of the man was boundless. He had kissed her, he had branded her, and now he was playing games in front of the very man he was betraying. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of wedding talk, fabric samples, and guest lists. Every time Arthur touched her hand, Elara felt a wave of nausea. Every time Julian spoke, she felt a spark of fury. She hated him. She hated that he had forced her to realize how hollow her life with Arthur would be. She hated that he was right. When the tea was finally cleared, Julian found a moment to corner her in the hallway as she prepared to leave. "You can't do it," he hissed, his voice a sharp blade in the quiet hall. Elara didn't look at him, focusing on buttoning her cloak. "I can and I will. Arthur is a good man. He is worth 10 of you." Julian stepped into her personal space, forcing her to look up. "He's a saint, Elara. And you? You're a sinner, just like me. Do you think he'll ever look at you the way I did this morning? Do you think he even knows the depth of the fire you hide?" "That fire is none of your business anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What happened this morning was a mistake. A moment of madness brought on by the dark. It is buried, Julian. If you have any respect for your brother, or for me, you will never speak of it again." Julian leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "You can bury it as deep as you like, Elara. But roots have a way of growing. You're going to be my sister-in-law. You're going to see me every holiday, every dinner, every ball. And every time you look at me, you're going to remember exactly how you felt when I held you against that wall. You're going to remember that you wanted me to never let go." He pulled back, a smirk playing on his lips, and bowed deeply. "Safe travels, Lady Elara. I shall see you at the gala. I look forward to the first dance. After all, Arthur is such a clumsy dancer. I'm sure he won't mind if I take over." Elara fled the house, the sound of her own heartbeat drowning out the noise of the carriage wheels. She was trapped. She was promised to a man who represented peace, while her soul was being pulled toward a man who represented a storm. The gala was 24 hours away, and for the first time in her life, Elara Vance was terrified of the dark, and even more terrified of what she might do when the sun went down again. The carriage ride back to her family estate felt like an eternity. Elara stared out the window, watching the London streets pass by in a grey haze. Her mind was a battlefield. One side held the images of her childhood, the expectations of her mother, and the proud smile on her father's face when the Duke of Pembroke had asked for her hand. The other side held the memory of the garden, the rough texture of Julian's coat, and the devastating realization that she had felt more alive in those few seconds of betrayal than in all the years of her pristine existence. Upon arriving home, she was immediately swept up by her mother, the Countess of Vance. "Elara! The dress has arrived. It is a masterpiece of ivory silk. You will look every bit the future Duchess." Her mother's excitement was a suffocating weight. Elara allowed herself to be poked and prodded by seamstresses, her body treated like a mannequin for a political alliance. As she stood on the pedestal, surrounded by mirrors, she saw herself for what she truly was, a woman about to be sold for a title. "Is something wrong, darling?" her mother asked, sensing the distance in her daughter's eyes. "You seem piqued." Just the nerves of the announcement, "Mother," Elara lied, the words tasting like ash. "It is a big change." "It is the change you were born for," the Countess said firmly. "The Thornes are the most powerful family in the country. To marry the Duke is to secure our family's legacy for generations. And Arthur is so stable. Not like that younger brother of his. Did you see Julian today? I heard he's returned from the continent with even more scandals attached to his name." Elara's heart skipped a beat. "He was there. He seemed, as he always does. A rogue," her mother sighed. "A waste of a good lineage. Thank heavens Arthur is the one with the title. Imagine the disaster if a woman like you were tied to a man like Julian. It would be fire and brimstone." Fire and brimstone. The words echoed in Elara's mind long after her mother left the room. She spent the evening in a trance, picking at her dinner and retreating to her rooms early. She tried to read, but the words on the page blurred into Julian's handwriting. She tried to sleep, but the moment she closed her eyes, she was back in the mist, feeling his hands on her waist. She got out of bed and paced the floor. She had to be rational. Julian was a provocateur. He probably didn't even care for her, he just wanted to win. He had always wanted what Arthur had. First the attention of their father, then the respect of the ton, and now, her. She was just another trophy for him to steal from his brother's mantle. That had to be it. It was a game to him. But as she remembered the way his hands had trembled when he touched her, the logic began to fail. Julian Thorne didn't tremble. He was the most composed man in England. If he was shaken, it meant something. It meant the kiss wasn't just a weapon. It was a confession. The night of the gala arrived with a suffocating grandeur. The Vance mansion was ablaze with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off the diamonds of the elite and the polished marble of the ballroom floor. For Elara, the opulence felt like a funeral shroud. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting on her father's arm. Her dress, a shimmering cascade of ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves, was a masterpiece, but she felt like a ghost inhabiting it. As they descended, the music swelled, a lively waltz that seemed to mock the stillness in her soul. At the bottom of the stairs, the Duke of Pembroke waited. Arthur looked every bit the noble husband, strong, reliable, and impeccably dressed in a deep navy tailcoat. Beside him, leaning against a gilded pillar with a glass of champagne in his hand, was Julian. He wasn't looking at the crowd, he was looking directly at her. His gaze was a physical weight, a dark heat that made her skin prickle beneath the fine silk. "You look breathtaking, Elara," Arthur said, stepping forward to take her hand. He kissed her knuckles, his touch polite and cooling. "I am the luckiest man in London tonight." Elara managed a small, practiced smile. "Thank you, Arthur. You look very handsome yourself." From the corner of her eye, she saw Julian's jaw tighten. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving her face. The first hour was a blur of polite conversation and forced laughter. Elara played her part to perfection, nodding at the right moments and accepting congratulations on the impending announcement. But she was constantly aware of Julian's position in the room. He was a shadow that followed her, a silent observer of her performance. He didn't approach her, but his presence was a constant provocation. Finally, the orchestra began a slower, more haunting melody. Arthur leaned in. "I believe this dance is mine, my dear." Elara nodded, ready to be led to the floor, when a hand reached out and intercepted them. Julian stepped into the light, his expression a mask of bored arrogance. Actually, Arthur, I believe you promised the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk the first dance of this set. She's been eyeing you from the buffet for 20 minutes, and you know how she gets when she's ignored." Arthur blinked, looking over at the formidable dowager. "Oh, blast. I did mention something to her earlier. But Elara—" "I shall look after Lady Elara," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's the least a brother can do. Go, Arthur. Save the family from the dowager's wrath." Arthur hesitated, then smiled at Elara. "You don't mind, do you? Julian will be a perfect gentleman for once." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Of course, Arthur. Go." As soon as Arthur was out of earshot, Julian's demeanor changed. The boredom vanished, replaced by a fierce, focused intensity. He didn't ask, he simply took her hand and led her toward the center of the ballroom. When he placed his hand on the small of her back, Elara nearly gasped. It was the same spot where he had held her in the garden, and the memory flooded back with agonizing clarity. They moved in silence for a moment, the rhythm of the waltz pulling them together and apart. "You look like a sacrificial lamb in that dress," Julian whispered, his lips dangerously close to her ear. Elara stiffened. "I look like a bride, Julian. Something you clearly have no respect for." "A bride to a man you don't love," he countered. "I saw you when he kissed your hand. You looked like you were counting the seconds until he let go. Is that the life you want? A lifetime of counting seconds?" "Love is a luxury for people who don't have responsibilities," Elara hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. "Arthur provides stability. He provides a future. What do you provide, Julian? Scandals? Whispers in the dark? A kiss that meant nothing?" Julian stopped mid-turn, forcing other couples to swerve around them. He ignored the stares. "You know it didn't mean nothing. That's why you're so angry. That's why you haven't been able to look me in the eye all night. You're terrified, Elara. Not of me, but of the fact that for 1 minute, just before dawn, you forgot about your responsibilities and remembered you were a woman." "Let me go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not yet," he said, pulling her back into the dance as the music picked up speed. "If you're going to marry him, if you're going to spend the rest of your life in that cold, perfect house, then give me this. Give me one dance where you don't pretend to be the perfect lady. Admit it, Elara. Admit that when I kissed you, you wanted to stay in that garden." "You are cruel," she said, her breath hitching. "To do this now, when everything is decided." "Nothing is decided until the priest speaks the words," Julian said, his grip on her hand tightening. "Arthur is a good man, yes. But he will never understand the darkness in you. He will never know how to handle the fire. He'll try to put it out, Elara. He'll turn you into a statue of a duchess." The music reached a crescendo, and Julian spun her closer than was proper, their bodies momentarily pressed together from chest to knee. In that second, the ballroom vanished. The people, the lights, the gossip, it all fell away, leaving only the two of them and the undeniable, magnetic pull of a forbidden desire. Elara looked up at him, her defenses crumbling. The hatred she felt for him was so closely intertwined with passion that she could no longer tell them apart. "I hate you," she breathed, her lips inches from his. "I know," he replied, a dark smirk touching his lips. "And I adore you for it." The music ended with a final, dramatic chord. Julian stepped back, bowing with perfect, mocking grace. He left her standing there, breathless and shaken, as Arthur returned, looking pleased with himself. "There you are." The dowager was quite charming, actually. "Shall we go find your father?" "He's ready to make the announcement." Elara felt Julian's eyes on her from across the room. He was leaning against a wall now, watching her with a look of predatory patience. He wasn't stopping the announcement. He was letting it happen. He wanted her to feel the weight of the chains before he broke them. As her father tapped a silver spoon against a crystal glass, calling for silence, Elara felt a wave of dizziness. The room grew quiet. Her father's voice rang out, proud and booming. "My friends, it is my greatest honor to announce the betrothal of my daughter, Lady Elara Vance, to Arthur Thorne, the Duke of Pembroke." A cheer went up. Applause thundered through the hall. Arthur took her hand and raised it, a gesture of triumph. Elara smiled until her face ached, nodding to the guests, but her gaze kept drifting back to Julian. He didn't clap. He simply raised his glass to her in a silent toast, his eyes promising a storm that no duke could weather. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the house was silent once more, Elara stood on her balcony, looking out toward the Blackwood estate in the distance. She was officially a future duchess. She had everything she was supposed to want. And yet, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice. A rustle in the shrubbery below caught her attention. A tall figure stepped into the moonlight. It was Julian. He didn't say a word, he simply stood there, looking up at her. He held up a single white jasmine flower, the same flower that had scented the air during their kiss. He laid it on the stone wall and disappeared into the night. Elara leaned against the cold railing, her heart racing. He was playing a dangerous game, and she was no longer sure she wanted him to stop. The marriage was set, the announcement was made, but the war between Elara and Julian was only just beginning. And in the silence of the night, she realized with a start that she wasn't just afraid of Julian anymore. She was afraid of the woman she became when he was near, a woman who would burn the whole world down just to feel that kiss one more time. The next morning, the reality of the engagement set in. Invitations for engagement dinners and parties began to flood the house. Arthur arrived early, bearing a gift, a necklace of sapphires that cost more than some country estates. "To match your eyes," he said softly, clasping it around her neck. "I want everyone to know you belong to the House of Pembroke." Elara looked at her reflection. The sapphires were heavy, cold. "It's beautiful, Arthur." "Thank you." "Julian has decided to stay at the estate for the duration of the season," Arthur mentioned casually, adjusting his cuffs. "I'm surprised. Usually, he's off to Paris or Italy by now. He says he wants to be here for the wedding preparations." "It's quite touching, don't you think?" "I didn't think he cared much for family duty." "Touching," Elara echoed, her voice flat. Julian wasn't staying for family duty. He was staying to haunt her. And as the days turned into weeks, that was exactly what he did. He was everywhere. At the park, at the theater, at every dinner party. He never crossed the line in public, but his presence was a constant reminder of the secret they shared. The weeks that followed the announcement were a slow torture of etiquette and unspoken desires. Every morning, Elara woke up to the realization that her life was being measured in lace swatches and silver patterns. Arthur was the perfect fiancé, visiting every afternoon with bouquets of lilies and stories of his plans for the Pembroke estate. He spoke of new stables and refurbished nurseries, building a future that sounded like a peaceful dream or a beautiful prison. And then there was Julian. He had moved into the Thorne townhouse in London, and his presence was like a low-frequency hum that Elara felt in her very bones. He didn't avoid her. In fact, he seemed to seek her out at every turn, always under the guise of helping with the arrangements. One rainy Tuesday, Elara found herself alone in the Thorne library. She was searching for a book on garden architecture to appease Arthur's interest, but her mind was elsewhere. The scent of old leather and rain-dampened earth filled the room. She was reaching for a high shelf when a shadow fell over her. "The third volume on the left is the one you're looking for," Julian's voice silkily moved through the air. He was standing so close behind her that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Though I doubt you'll find much excitement in the history of topiary." Elara didn't turn around. She kept her arm outstretched, her fingers grazing the spine of the book. "Excitement is not what I'm looking for, Julian. Stability is." "Liar," he whispered. He reached up, his hand covering hers on the bookshelf. His fingers were warm, his touch a stark contrast to the cold rain tapping against the window panes. He pulled the book down but didn't hand it to her. Instead, he forced her to turn around, trapping her between the mahogany shelves and his chest. "You look tired, Elara," he said, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made her want to hide and be seen all at once. "The Duke's sapphires are heavy, aren't they? They seem to be weighing your head down." "They are a gift from my future husband," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "A man who respects me. A man who doesn't corner me in libraries to remind me of my weaknesses." Julian leaned in, one hand resting on the shelf next to her head. "I don't want to remind you of your weaknesses, Elara. I want to remind you of your strength. You're fighting so hard to be the woman they want you to be. But I've tasted the woman you actually are. That woman doesn't want stability. She wants to be consumed." "Stop it," she pleaded, her heart racing. "You're his brother. How can you be so heartless? Arthur loves you. He trusts you." A flicker of genuine pain crossed Julian's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Arthur loves the idea of me. He loves the brother he thinks he can redeem. But he doesn't know me. Not like you do. And he certainly doesn't know you. If he did, he'd know that every time he touches you, you're thinking of that dawn in the garden." Elara's hand flew up to slap him, but he caught her wrist midair. His grip was firm but gentle. "Don't," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Don't pretend you don't feel it. The way the air thins when we're in the same room. The way you look for me at every ball before you look for him. You're marrying a ghost of a man, Elara, because you're afraid of the living one standing right in front of you." "I am marrying a man who will never make me cry," she countered, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. Julian's thumb traced the pulse point on her wrist. "No. He'll just make you disappear. Bit by bit, until there's nothing left but a duchess in a painting." He let go of her wrist and handed her the book. "Go. Read about your gardens. Plan your fences. But remember, Elara, fences can be jumped. And I've always been a very good jumper." She fled the library, the book clutched to her chest like a shield. She spent the rest of the day in her room, refusing to see anyone. The walls felt like they were closing in. She looked at her engagement ring, a massive diamond surrounded by emeralds. It was a masterpiece of jewelry, but to her, it looked like a shackle. The tension reached a breaking point during the Thornes' annual house party at their country estate, Willowmere. It was a week-long affair, meant to celebrate the upcoming nuptials. The house was filled with the cream of society, all there to witness the union of two great houses. One evening, after a particularly grueling dinner where she had to endure Julian's suggestive glances across the table, Elara slipped out to the terrace. The night air was cool, smelling of pine and lake water. She walked down the stone steps toward the lake, needing to be away from the noise and the suffocating expectations. A small rowing boat was tied to the dock. On a whim, Elara stepped into it, untying the rope. She didn't row far, just enough to drift in the center of the moonlight-dappled water. The silence was a relief. For a moment, she wasn't a future duchess or a daughter. She was just a woman under the stars. "I thought I might find you here," a voice called from the shore. Julian was standing on the dock, his coat discarded, his white shirt glowing in the dark. Without waiting for an invitation, he dove into the water. Elara watched in stunned silence as he swam toward the boat with powerful, efficient strokes. He reached the side and pulled himself up, the water cascading off his muscles, his shirt clinging to his skin like a second layer. "You're insane," she whispered as the boat rocked under his weight. "Probably," he gasped, wiping the water from his eyes. He sat opposite her, his presence filling the small space. "But I couldn't let you sit out here all alone. It's dangerous for a future duchess to be unescorted." "The only danger I see is sitting 3 feet away from me," Elara said, trying to keep her gaze on his face and not on the way his shirt had become translucent. "I won't hurt you, Elara. I've never wanted to hurt you." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look like a tragic hero from a poem. "I've spent 10 years hating you because it was the only way I could keep myself from loving you. You were always so perfect. So Arthur's. Even when we were children, I knew you were the one thing I could never have." The honesty in his voice was more devastating than any of his provocations. Elara felt her resolve crumbling. "Why are you telling me this now? It's too late." "Is it?" he asked, reaching out to touch a damp lock of her hair. "Or is it finally the right time? Arthur is a good man, Elara. Truly. He deserves a woman who looks at him the way you look at me. And you deserve to be loved with a passion that terrifies you. Not a love that settles you like a piece of furniture." He moved from his seat to the floor of the boat, kneeling before her. The boat swayed, but neither of them noticed. He took both of her hands in his skin cool from the water but his touch burning. "Run away with me. Tonight. We'll go to the continent. Let the scandal break. Let them talk. I have enough wealth of my own to keep us in comfort for 10 lifetimes. We can be free, Elara. No titles, no expectations. Just us." Elara's breath hitched. The offer was a madness, a social suicide. But for a fleeting second, she saw it, a life of sun-drenched Italian villas and moonlit walks where she didn't have to hide her thoughts. A life where she could be angry, and passionate, and whole. "I can't," she sobbed, the weight of her duty crushing the dream before it could take flight. "My father, the scandal would ruin my sisters. It would destroy Arthur's reputation. I can't be the cause of so much pain." "And what about your pain?" Julian asked, his voice cracking. "What about the slow death of your soul every time you lie in his bed and dream of me?" "I will learn to stop dreaming," she said, though she knew it was a lie. Julian looked at her for a long moment, a deep, abiding sadness in his eyes. Then, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. They stayed like that for a long time, 2 souls caught in a current they couldn't fight. You are the bravest woman I know, he whispered. And the most foolish. I will respect your choice, Elara. I will stand at that altar as his best man. I will watch you give your life away. But know this, I will never stop wanting you. And I will never stop being the man you should have chosen. He stood up and, without another word, dived back into the lake, swimming toward the shore. Elara sat in the drifting boat, the silence now heavier than it had ever been. She looked at the moon and realized that the dawn was coming soon. And this time, there would be no kiss to mark the end of the night. Only the cold, certain reality of a life she had chosen out of fear, while the man who loved her like a storm swam away into the shadows. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of suffocating lace and forced smiles. The Thorne estate was a hive of activity, but for Elara, it felt like the walls were slowly inching closer. Every evening, she had to endure celebratory dinners where Arthur toasted to their future, his eyes full of a simple, honest devotion that made her feel like a criminal. Across the table, Julian remained a silent, brooding presence. He no longer provoked her with words, but his silence was louder than any insult. He watched her with the hollow gaze of a man watching a tragedy unfold, and Elara found herself constantly seeking his eyes, looking for a sign that he might stop the madness. The night before the ceremony, a massive storm broke over Willowmere. Thunder shook the foundations of the house, and jagged bolts of lightning illuminated the rolling hills in bursts of eerie blue light. Elara couldn't sleep. The weight of the impending I-do was a physical pressure on her chest. She left her room, her bare feet silent on the cold corridor floors, and wandered toward the conservatory. She needed to feel the rain, even if it was through the glass. She wasn't alone. Julian was there, standing amidst the exotic ferns and damp earth, staring out at the deluge. He didn't turn when she entered, but she saw his shoulders tense. "It's a bad omen, isn't it?" she whispered, the sound of the rain drowning out the tremor in her voice. "A storm like this on the eve of a duke's wedding." "It's not an omen, Elara," Julian replied, his voice flat. "It's just weather. The world doesn't care about our petty arrangements. It doesn't care if you spend the rest of your life miserable in a palace." He finally turned, and in the flash of a lightning bolt, she saw the raw exhaustion on his face. "Why are you here? You should be dreaming of your duchess's coronet." "I can't breathe, Julian," she confessed, the truth finally breaking through her defenses. "Every time I look at the altar, I feel like I'm looking at a scaffold. But I can't leave. My father, the scandal would kill him. He's already so frail. And Arthur. Arthur has done nothing but love me in his own way. How can I destroy two good men for my own selfishness?" Julian stepped toward her, the scent of rain and tobacco clinging to him. "And what about the man you're destroying by staying? Do you think Arthur will be happy when he realizes his wife is a hollow shell? Do you think he won't notice the way you flinch when he touches you? You think you're being noble, Elara, but you're just being a coward. You're choosing the pain you know over the life you're afraid to take." "It's easy for you to say," she cried, a sob escaping her throat. "You've never had to be the good one. You've built your life on being the disappointment. I have everyone's hopes resting on my shoulders. I am the bridge that keeps my family from falling into debt. I am the reputation that allows my sisters to marry well. I am not just Elara. I am a Vance." Julian reached out, his hands gripping her shoulders. He shook her gently, forcing her to look at him. "You are Elara. You are the girl who read forbidden poetry in the library. You are the woman who kissed me until the sun came up. Everything else is a mask. If you walk down that aisle tomorrow, the mask becomes your skin. And I won't stay to watch it happen. I've ordered my bags packed. I leave for the coast at dawn. The thought of him leaving, truly leaving, felt like a knife to the heart. Elara grabbed the lapels of his coat, her knuckles white. You can't. You're the best man. Arthur needs you. Arthur has a dozen friends who can stand in my place, Julian hissed. I can't stand there, Elara. I can't be the one to hand him the ring that binds you to him. I'm not that strong. I've tried to be the rogue, the brother who doesn't care, but I've reached my limit. If you stay, I go. Forever. The storm outside raged, a mirror to the chaos in Elara's soul. She looked into Julian's dark, desperate eyes and felt the last of her resolve snapping. She didn't care about the debts. She didn't care about the gossip. In the flickering light of the conservatory, there was only this man and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of freedom. Julian. She breathed, her hands sliding up to his neck. He didn't wait for her to finish. He pulled her into a kiss that was desperate and final, a taste of everything she was about to lose and everything she could have. It wasn't the teasing kiss of the garden, it was a pact. For a few minutes, the world outside, the Duke, the debt, the wedding dress, didn't exist. There was only the heat of his skin and the rain drumming against the glass. But as the thunder rolled directly overhead, the door to the conservatory creaked open. The light from a single candle spilled across the floor. Elara? Julian? They sprang apart, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Standing in the doorway was Arthur. He wasn't wearing his usual mask of calm. He looked pale, his dressing gown hanging loosely on his frame. He looked at Elara's flushed face, then at his brother's defiant stance. The silence that followed was more deafening than the thunder. I couldn't sleep, Arthur said, his voice strangely hollow. I thought I heard voices. He walked into the room, the candlelight trembling in his hand. He looked at the two of them, his gaze lingering on the way Julian's hand was still hovering near Elara's arm. How long? Arthur, it's not what you think, Elara began, her voice cracking. Don't lie to him, Julian interrupted, his voice steady. He deserves better than that. It's been years, Arthur. Or perhaps it's been forever. I've loved her since we were children. And tonight I asked her to leave with me. Arthur took a shaky breath, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was a profound sadness in them, but no surprise. I knew there was a shadow between us. I thought it was just your usual rivalry. I thought once we were married, she would see that I could provide the peace she needed. But peace isn't what you want, is it, Elara? Elara looked down at her feet, unable to meet his gaze. I tried, Arthur. I swear I tried to be the woman you deserved. You cannot force the heart to be practical, Elara, Arthur said, stepping closer. He looked at his brother. And you, Julian, you were going to let me marry her? You were going to let me live a lie for the rest of my life? I was going to leave, Julian said. I was going to let her choose her duty. I didn't want to break you, Arthur. Arthur laughed, a dry, bitter sound. You would have broken me more by letting me believe she loved me. A duke's pride is a fragile thing, but a man's soul is more important. He turned back to Elara. Go. Both of you. What? Elara gasped. The storm will break by morning, Arthur said, his voice regaining some of its noble authority. My carriage is ready in the stables. Take it. Go to the coast, take a ship to France. I will tell the guests tomorrow that the wedding is off, that I have realized we are not suited. I will take the blame. It will be a scandal, yes, but a duke can survive a scandal. A woman, however, cannot survive a loveless marriage. Arthur, I can't let you do that, Elara whispered, tears streaming down her face. Your reputation. My reputation is built on being a gentleman, Elara, Arthur said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. And a gentleman does not keep a woman prisoner. Julian, if you ever make her regret this, if you ever treat her with anything less than the devotion I was prepared to give, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Do you understand? Julian nodded, his expression one of profound respect. I understand, brother. Then go, Arthur said, turning his back on them. Before I change my mind and remember that I am supposed to be angry. Elara and Julian didn't wait. They ran through the dark, rain-soaked halls, grabbing only what was necessary. As they reached the stables, the first hint of light was beginning to touch the sky, the same bruised violet of that dawn in the garden. They climbed into the carriage, and as the horses surged forward, Elara looked back at the great house. She saw a single candle burning in the window of the conservatory. The journey was a blur of speed and adrenaline. As they reached the cliffs overlooking the sea, the sun finally broke through the clouds. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling. Julian reached over and took Elara's hand, his thumb stroking the place where her engagement ring had once been. She had left it on the table in the conservatory. Are you afraid? He asked, his eyes searching hers. Elara looked at the horizon, at the vast, open sea that led to a future without titles, without rules, and without masks. She looked at the man beside her, the man who was her enemy, her lover, and her soul. No, she said, her voice firm. For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the dawn. The boat to France was a world away from the gilded ballrooms of London. As the white cliffs of Dover faded into a salt-sprayed mist, Elara felt the invisible threads of her old life snapping one by one. She stood at the railing, the wind whipping her hair into a tangled halo, no longer the polished Lady Elara Vance, but a woman whose name now belonged to no one but herself. Julian was beside her, his cloak wrapped around them both, his presence a solid, grounding warmth in the cool sea air. They were social outcasts, their names likely being dragged through the mud of every drawing room in England, yet Elara had never felt lighter. In the weeks that followed, they traveled south. Away from the prying eyes of the ton and the crushing weight of expectations, their relationship shifted. The sharp, provocative armor they had used to protect themselves for years began to melt. Without an audience to play for, the enemy facade crumbled, leaving behind a raw, profound intimacy. They found a small villa on the outskirts of Florence, a place of sun-drenched stone and overgrown olive groves that smelled of wild thyme and freedom. One evening, sitting on their terrace as the Tuscan sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in strokes of gold and fire, Julian looked at her with a softness she had once thought him incapable of. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice low. "The titles, the security, the life you were promised?" Elara looked at her hands, now slightly calloused from gardening and stained with the ink of the letters she wrote to her sisters, letters she hoped Arthur would eventually allow them to read. She looked at Julian, at the man who had fought for her soul when she was ready to give it away. "I regret the pain we caused Arthur," she said honestly. "But I could never regret choosing to live. For the first time, Julian, I don't feel like I'm performing a role. I am simply Elara." "And what of the fire?" Julian teased, a ghost of his old smirk appearing. "Is it satisfied with this quiet life?" The fire is no longer a destructive thing, Julian, she replied, reaching out to trace the line of his jaw. It's a hearth. It's what keeps me warm. You didn't just wake me up, you gave me a home. Back in London, the scandal had indeed been the talk of the season. Arthur, true to his word, had handled the situation with a dignity that earned him the respect of even the harshest critics. He took the blame for the broken engagement, claiming a change of heart, though whispers of the truth still lingered. Eventually, the ton moved on to the next scandal, and Arthur found a quiet peace of his own, governing his estates with a kindness that became his legacy. He never married, but he sent a single, unsigned letter to a villa in Florence a year later. It contained no words, only a dried jasmine flower, a silent gesture of forgiveness. For Elara and Julian, life was not without its challenges. They were often lonely, and the sting of exile sometimes felt sharp. But every morning, as the sun broke over the Italian hills, they would remember that dawn in the garden. They would remember the kiss that ruined their lives and saved their souls. They were no longer the Duke's brother and the Earl's daughter, they were two people who had looked into the abyss of a conventional life and chosen to jump together. In the end, their story wasn't one of polite society or political alliances. It was a story of the messy, inconvenient, and transformative power of a love that refused to be silenced. As the stars began to crown the Tuscan night, Julian pulled Elara into his arms, dancing a slow, private waltz on the stone terrace without the need for music. "You're still a terrible dancer," she whispered against his chest, her eyes bright with laughter. "And you're still far too opinionated," he countered, pulling her closer. "But I wouldn't have it any other way." The dawn was coming, as it always did. But they were no longer afraid of what the light would reveal. They were exactly where they were meant to be, not in the shadows of a brother's shadow, but in the brilliant, unyielding light of a love that had finally come home. If you love timeless romance, noble scandals, and unforgettable stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and explore the other tales on our channel. Your next favorite love story might be just one click away.